Good evening, everyone. Welcome back for another Azure Thursday. It's April of 2022, and we have a new host. Hi, Stefan.
Hey, good evening.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How about you?
I'm very good, thanks.
Cool.
Doing this today from our new streaming setup for the first time. So if anybody sees some logos popping in and popping out, it's just us spinning the wheels for the first time.
Yep.
But we'll have fun. Shall we get our first guest in?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, Roel.
Hey, Stefan. I'm Stefan.
Hey, Stefan.
Different spelling, but there we go. Not too many of us. Steven, I think, is the more common.
True.
Good to have you.
Great to have you. And sorry, I'm kind of new to this crew as well. So it's Stefan and Roel, or how's it pronounced?
It's Roel.
Roel. Oh,
it's really Dutch.
You can try
it. I won't, but I appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm super excited to join you guys and talk about ASP.NET Core in .NET 6 and kind of the whole minimal API effort that we've been working on. So I'm not sure what you guys normally do as far as intros go, but I can hop in whenever.
Yeah, the one thing I don't want to do is ruin your intro slide. So if you just if you have one, I suggest.
Okay, yeah. So you'll see that I did not create a new deck for this, but let's go. So I was stepping in for Maria, who was originally going to give this talk, but just stepping in to help out, and this is minimal API. So what I'm showing you right now is the deck for the MVP summit last year. So if any of you are MVPs, you might have seen this already. But what's interesting is now a year later, we can talk about what's happened in the last year, where things are going. And, not everyone's seen this. So, I mean, a year ago, this was under NDA, but I looked through all these slides and I think we're pretty safe here. So this is going to talk about the ideas behind minimal APIs and defining APIs without like web API controllers or controllers. So now we've already released this in .NET 6 when this deck was written. It was yet to be released. So this is the tweet that kind of got, it was David Fowler and Maria who really did the initial research to figure out like what will take new developers and particularly developers who are new to .NET, right? So you might have experience with like Express or Python with something like Flask, Sinatra and Ruby. Like these are all very common to write microservices in other frameworks. And there are solutions and were solutions for that in .NET. But if you're using, ASP.NET Core templates, there's a lot more going on with the various hosting and dependency injection and all of that. So, I mean, this slide is basically saying like, hey, look at like basically how big these sample Dapper apps are for these various web frameworks. And, for stuff like here we got Python and Flask, we have Go, we have Node.js and Express, and then here was the C# folder. And there's just a lot involved with that. There's like the program CS, the startup CS, all the various app settings, properties, models, controllers. And for something that's meant to be simple, like a distributed calculator microservice, it's or some sort of like actor kind of thing, right? Because Dapper. It seemed a little heavy. So we wanted to see like, or complex, right? Ceremonial is the words we used. And we wanted to see if we could do anything to improve that. So basically, we can go and quickly show you like what ASP.NET Core apps have looked like traditionally. And I asked you guys like before this talk what the audience was, and I think that most of the people watching this are pretty familiar with .NET and ASP.NET Core. So I'm going to kind of slide through this, but here's an example of a weather app written using .NET 5. So this is pretty straightforward from the template. You have your program main, calls create host builder, and then uses a startup class, right? So like most people's program main or program CS in my experience prior to .NET 6 all look exactly like this or very close. So yeah, if you're looking for really the business logic of initializing your application, it exists in the startup class. And then you'd have these kind of magic methods that you'd have to know what they're called, what parameters they take. The templates create these for you so you can figure it out. But and of course there are documents, and so there's some standardization here. But for people who aren't like familiar with this kind of hosted model, the startup model, it can be unclear, like when is configure services called? Like, is it called before configure, like after configure? It's called before, but like these are the types of questions that could be confusing to new users. What is the app? How is that different than, say, like wrong program CS? That's skipping ahead in the presentation. Let's do that. All right. So yeah, basically, yeah. So this is the old model, and that's all I wanted to show. So what Maria and David did even before I stepped in is they worked on a prototype of Feather HTTP, which was a GitHub repo. You might have seen it. I'm pretty sure it's in David Fowler's org. It's like David Fowl /Feather HTTP. And that was the creation of like the new hosting model in .NET 6. Like the name is even the same, web application builder. Obviously through the progress of .NET 6, we refined it, fixed a lot of bugs. But before working too much on this prototype, we decided, actually, David created a new yeah, he actually did create a new org for that. So it's Feather HTTP framework. You can see it in this video. No real use for it anymore because it conflicts with what's in .NET 6, but this is like kind of the early stages of what became web application builder in .NET 6. So yeah, David talked to Maria. Maria's like, yo, like we should totally do a user study on this, right? And see what this, if this appeals to developers, web developers from other frameworks, and new developers in general. Now, there's been a lot of messaging on Twitter and like a lot of, I would say, consternation with .NET 6 and the changes that have come with C#10, like top-level statements, default global usings, things like that. And a lot of people will say like, I can see how it's useful for people who are used to coming from Python or from Node, and it's good for new people. But I've heard from a lot of experienced developers, and this is how I feel myself, is I like writing less lines of code as well. Like I don't like writing all that repeated boilerplate. So like that it's great for new people, which is what the user study indicated. Spoiler alert. It's also great for new developers, which is why we've updated all of our templates and so forth. So yeah, we took lessons from .NET Interactive, super easy way to learn with notebooks. You don't need like all those usings and a program main and all that. We've even played around with using ASP.NET in that. And we're optimizing for like common happy path. So we had some conversations with people who are not traditionally .NET developers. At this point, I got brought in for some of this to discuss what say, Java developers and PHP developers thought of this new like Feather HTTP stuff. And it was super interesting seeing their feedback, talking about basically what it felt like to them to write that old host builder style startup application versus what we eventually introduced in .NET 6. And even though there's kind of the same amount of magic going on under the covers, it didn't feel that way to developers. So like, even though things like dependency injection stuff still exist, we're not putting it in your face if you don't need it. So I think that was a big thing. So these are some quotes that we got from those user studies. People see, people from startups and so forth see Microsoft and C# and .NET and ASP.NET Core is kind of enterprisey. So this was like the perceptions they had going into the user study, these quotes. And this was the tutorial that we did. We were doing like a to-do app using the new Feather HTTP. And basically, because of that, people, seem pretty excited about it overall. Now you could say, hey, we're paying these people, they're doing user study. But I would say people are usually pretty ready to give critical feedback because, they get paid the same either way. And there were a few that did, but like overall, overwhelmingly, the feedback was strong. So basically, yeah. We decided to reintroduce ASP.NET. So this isn't quite the reveal this was at ASP.NET MVP Summit a year ago, because a lot of you have seen this, but this was one of the weather examples. This one we actually did at Build. So this same API that we saw before, and like there was this controller, I didn't even show you that because you're talking about the host. We rewrote basically identically using minimal APIs just to see what that would look like. This isn't the to-do app, but similar kind of line of code reduction and so forth. So if we look at this now, aside from our models, which are here, the entire code is within program CS. So this is basically hitting this Azure weather service, and it's making 3 requests and like combining this into a forecast. This was an app that was used as part of the build demo last year. We also had like a Maui front end and all of this that was using this as a backend service. But there are a few major things that I want to point out, right? So program CS, right, is substantially different. And this is taking advantage of a lot of new C# features. For those of you who haven't used C# 10 yet, you're missing out. Like, I'm surprised you're watching this video. It's been talked about like all over Twitter and so forth, but like no program main is one of the most immediately obvious things about this this app. So basically, as soon as you put a statement in a top level of a C# file in your project, it doesn't technically need to be called program CS. It's inferred to be program main. Another big difference you'll notice is the lack of usings. So what's going on there is that if we want to look at our implicit usings enable, right? This is a feature basically of the Web SDK that will bring in namespaces like ASP.NET Core hosting, extension hosting, things like that into namespace if you're in an ASP.NET app. So don't have to write the usings. And then probably the biggest difference is the lack of a startup class or controller. So whereas before, if we wanted to enable cores and startup or whatever, we would have to, in configure services, basically call add cores, which I didn't do here because we weren't actually running the old app as a service on Azure at the time. But cores was important for that Maui app we were talking about at Build that we did last year. So here, the way cores works in ASP.NET Core is that you set up policies, and then you set up middleware, and then you add metadata to an endpoint. So this is the same attribute that you would add on a controller action. And it works more or less the same way. So if you were in here, you can do enable cores weather, right? And this is literally the exact same attribute that you would use in MVC. Kind of as a side note, this is also a new C# 10 feature. So, I mean, there's a lot of new C# 10 features that we took advantage of. Previously, you could not add any attributes to lambdas. They had to be actual methods. I'm not sure if you could add attributes to local functions before, but even local functions are a little more cumbersome. Another thing that you could do instead of using this like enable cores attribute, you could do require cores. And this takes the policy name still, but this is doing an identical thing. So if you were to like, for example, by the way, if you guys don't use like source.net when you don't have stuff open in solution, for things that are like in the runtime in ASP.NET Core, it's super easy and fast. So like the point is that I'm trying to make here is all this is doing is adding basically the same attribute, that require cores method, to basically the endpoint metadata. So what's happening when you call requires cores is it's adding like this is just an attribute. It's adding this attribute to this weather location endpoint. So that's pretty cool, I would say. So there are a couple ways to do that. Another kind of thing that I like about minimal APIs here, and people have different feelings about dependency injection. A lot of people think that it's too much magic. We are using it here for cores because basically the cores middleware requires that to define policies. Though we're thinking about ways to make both cores and auth easier in that regard. So basically you can define policy in line. That's more like .NET 7 stuff. Not yet, but like another thing that a lot of ASP.NET apps would often use services for would be like an HTTP client factory. So it is possible to like inject an HTTP client as a singleton. So you could do like builder.services.add HTTP client. And then you could, inject an HTTP client over here, right? So basically any service can be added as a parameter to a minimal action, right? So things that you would typically add is like a controller parameter, right? So like in the weather controller, you might take this HTTP client factory. Like you could very much do that same thing. So you could do like HTTP client factory, etc. And that would work. But the main reason for using the HTTP client factory is so you're not newing up an HTTP client every time. Or that's one of the main reasons, because each time you do that, you create a new TCP connection that can lead to issues like port exhaustion if you're not careful. And generally, it's inefficient to like do a new TLS handshake every time you make a request. But what's kind of cool about using callbacks instead of controllers to define endpoints is that you can just close over a single HTTP client that we create in scope. And this means that this HTTP client lives for the duration of program main, basically. So for the duration of the program. So you're getting connection reuse, you're getting that nice efficiency. I've heard people say like, oh, are you sure you want to do that? Like, HTTP client factory also like refreshes connections if like DNS changes and so forth. But secret, so does the default sockets HTTP handler for HTTP client. It will refresh connections to try to pick up DNS changes and so forth. You can just set a connection timeout if that's important to you. So yeah, I honestly really like basically just closing over an HTTP client for simple microservices like that instead of going the whole HTTP client factory route. So yeah, let's like quickly just like test out this API. There are a few other things that I want to talk about, but let's just hit Control F5 and see if it's still working. All right, so I got a 405 because I changed this to a map post when I was messing around and preparing for this talk. So So 405 is wrong HTTP method for what it's worth. When you work on Kestrel, which I have for a long time, you learn some of these status codes pretty quickly. All right, so we'll try it again. Oh, another thing to note with minimal APIs, and this is kind of sad, is like hot reload doesn't work great. Like, so for example, if I were to hot reload right now, after changing map post to map get, it would not do anything. So I could hit that. I could hit like Control F5 or whatever, and it should. Okay, that time it was smart enough to not do a hot reload. But sometimes it's not. So I just suggest like basically avoiding hot reload and doing restart application. The big reason why you want to restart the entire application is this is all in program main, right? So unless you rerun program main, like that map post call never gets turned into a map get effectively because you got to rerun the whole program. So yeah, so this is grabbing data. This is latitude and longitude for Seattle. That's where I'm at right now, more or less, Kirkland. And this is just returning current weather, hourly forecast, and daily forecast if you get low enough. So that's great. Problem is like, hey, if I have a bunch of APIs or whatever, like how do I discover this? Like with MVC, I could create like swagger.json or OpenAPI, right? It's the official standardized name for that. And one cool thing is that you can do that. You can basically continue getting the Swagger stuff just like you would with a web API like MVC controller. And I will copy paste a little just to show you how to do that. So a lot of our templates, not our empty template, but if you do like the minimal web API template, and I can show you that in a second if people are interested, have this basically already. So to quickly describe what we're doing here, this is basically adding metadata for endpoints defined via like map get, map post, what we're calling like minimal route handlers. This adds the metadata to MVC, basically API Explorer model. ASP.NET Core itself doesn't have like an open API description of its endpoints, but MVC has an endpoint description called like API Explorer. And that is how Swashbuckle and NSwag then generate their swagger.json. So in this case, add Swagger. So add endpoints API Explorer is like included in the ASP.NET Core framework. It's just part of .NET 6. You'll see that it's like in the MVC API Explorer assembly. And then add SwaggerGen is Swashbuckle. And that's what's taking that API Explorer stuff. You can see Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core SwaggerGen, and turning that into the open API description. And then a lot like use cores, we have to then add some middleware. And then I also have to add the Swashbuckle package. So if you run the web API minimal template, like -- minimal, and I can show you that in a second, like this will get added all for you. Okay, I already had that there, so we're good. So this is all you need, and then now we can start looking at Swagger stuff. Hopefully, if I didn't mess that up. I copied and pasted, choice shouldn't. All right, so now we have our single endpoint, that weather location, and then you can see that it takes a location. So I can just like pick a random location. It should be fine. It's just querying Azure weather, so I don't know what's there. Probably in the middle of the ocean. People who are better at geography could tell me. All right, bad request. So apparently I should have stuck with what I know. So, but basically what this is doing is it's looking for common delineated longitude and latitude and longitude. So anyway, yeah, so here you can get your result. You can try your API out in Swagger UI, all that kind of cool. If you use a tool like .NET's HTTP REPL, you can, this is kind of cool if you do. You can like list the weather endpoint and stuff like that. So another thing is like we've defined a few extension methods on these that will allow you to basically add to the metadata. You can basically add more details about what's returned and so forth. So right now, one of the advantages, say over Node.js or something, is that if you look at this, you get like an auto-generated example value and schema for the return value. So, you know, one thing that this demo kind of hides, right, because it's comparing itself to, say, a similar app in Node.js using Express, is that you do have this like strongly typed information. So you have to write it. So here we have a bunch of classes that are basically being used to deserialize using get from JSON async on HTTP client these JSON return values from the Azure Weather Service. But in doing that, you get this nice Swagger schema that people can use to exploit your API. You can use some extension methods, so we can do like with tags, foo bar if we refresh. And again, we want to reload the entire app. You know, we now have these in like separate foobar categories. This endpoint is like repeated. Another interesting thing is that, all right, how is this coordinate being parsed, right? You see that I'm passing in these like comma separated values. So if I did like, I'm really surprised that 0, 0 didn't work. I'm guessing there's just like no weather station there. Yeah, all right. I'm done guessing coordinates. All right, so so one thing we could do is change how we take this coordinate, right? So it's taking comma separated values. What this really is calling is it's calling this try parse method that we define it on a custom coordinate type. So really it's just calling double try parse twice after splitting over the comma, and then it's creating a new instance of itself, returning as an out value. So if I did a request that was like not parsable, which I don't think is what was happening earlier. Like when I did 0, 0, I think they can still parse as two doubles, but you're getting an error from, I guess we could just look at the, yeah, so from HTTP client itself when it's forwarding the request. But we can get an error sooner than that by just putting in something that's like not a double, for example. And then, you know, you'll just get a 400 and it will say failed to bind parameter from foobar. And that basically just means that this try parse returned false. So it's because this type has try parse on it that it's being read from the query string, right? So what we could do instead is we could add an attribute and say, actually, this isn't supposed to be from the query string. It's supposed to be from the body. In that case, it will no longer call try parse. So if we were to like redo this, I should probably make it a post. That's why it was a post earlier. Interesting note, not everyone may know, is like you can post to get endpoints. At least Kesh will allow it. I wouldn't expect everything to allow it. I wouldn't try, because who knows like what front end might complain about it. But that is the thing that you can do. All right. Probably. Oh, I'm debugging this time. All right, that's a bug in the preview version, but I think it's still running. Maybe. All right. All right, I'm seeing build succeeded. All right. So while I'm looking at this, do we have any questions? I can't hear anyone. Should I be looking at the chat? Oh. All right. All right, yeah, so now I'm getting that 405, which is what I expect with the map post. So if we look at the Swagger, yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. So now this is a post request, right? So now for the request body, there's a schema. So instead of sending this as part of the query string, I can send the latitude and longitude using this. And if I use 0, 0 again, I expect that I'll get that same error from HTTP client, which you do. But yeah, if I were to like put in the right coordinates, then you would get the same result that you had before. And you'll notice that like when you make the request, it's actually, yeah, this location parameter is being sent as just location with brackets, which is fine because we're not actually using that slug of the route value anymore. So that can be anything. Alrighty. So, another thing that is kind of interesting about this are like results types. This didn't even exist when we were originally showing those MVP Summit slides. But like right now, you'll notice like we're returning this anonymous object. Let's move this back to mapget for ease of use. So anytime that you return like a plain old object from or a minimal route handler, it's going to get serialized as JSON. But there are some extra things that you may want to do. Like you might want to choose the status code. You might want to do any number of things. So like one way you could change the status code, like let's say that we wanted to make this like I'm not even sure. So you can add an HTTP context parameter. Like you have to specify the type here, but you could just then go like context.response.status code, and we could say that this is an error, for instance. And if we did, or maybe like this is a 201 created response, even though we didn't create anything. But let's just say it was, so it'd be easier to see. So at this point, if we were to run the app again, and then hit the Swagger. Oh yeah, I guess we could just like, we have to look at the developer tools, but the idea is you should have a 201 response. And yeah, so we do. But like there might be a better way to do that, right? So one way you can do this is you can just do results, which is a static class that's already like globally included by default. And then we have a created method. And it takes, along with the URI where this is created, which is what you're supposed to do because you're supposed to have a location header when you turn a 201. You can also supply an object. So if you were to run that again, and we were to look at the developer tools again, and then this time we probably even accurately have a location header, which would be nice. So yeah, you have that location / that I added. So that has some built-in stuff, and pretty much all the time we serialize using one of the built-in results methods. Let's get back to the right programs. Yes. Yeah. We are going to do some sort of JSON anytime we're serializing an actual object to the result. But that doesn't stop you from defining your own customized results. So like you'll see that this results.created is returning this iResult type. So this iResult type is basically, for those of you who are familiar, request delegate, the interface. Like this is literally just request delegate here, this execute async. But rather than returning a request delegate literally from your minimal API, we felt it would be better to be able to return an actual object. So let's say that I wanted to serialize this output as XML. One thing I could do is I could define my own. If I hit tab, look at how fast I can type. I can define my own iResult, right? So this iResult shows how good I am at spelling better, is serializing to XML. So, here's my request delegate, so to speak. So once a minimal route handler returns an XML result, it can be constructed with the object that we're trying to serialize as XML. And then when it runs, we serialize this to a memory stream. The reason I'm not just serializing directly to HTTP context.response.body is because you do not want to block. Basically, it's because there's no serialized async. So memory stream is guaranteed when you call like write to complete immediately every time. HTTP context.response.write will throw because you should be calling write async instead. There are options to allow you to do like synchronous writes in ASP.NET, and I don't recommend using them because if you get too many requests, you'll experience thread pool starvation. Even this is like not super efficient because it's allocating a bunch of arrays under the cover, but at least it's not wasting a bunch of threads. So yeah, just serializing XML. That's all it's doing, and then writing it to the response body. And then this is kind of an interesting part. You'll see that this is just defining an extension method on this interface called iResult extensions. And if we look at that interface, there's nothing on it. So there's literally no members. So that's why we're just discarding that variable, basically. But we are returning a new XML result of T. So it's like, okay, why do I write an extension method here? And the reason is because instead of calling like results.created here, we could call results.extensions, which has, guess which type? iResult extensions, right? And that's all it is that empty interface. But it's basically a place to hang off your own extension method. So now if you want to do XML, you can do that. And this is directly equivalent to returning new XML whatever XML result, like boom, something like that, right? So one thing that's nice about this though is like when you're calling a constructor, right, you have to supply the type parameter. Like here this is like an unspeakable type, right? Like if we were to look at this in our Swagger output, like we have all the types for the input stuff, like but the actual type we're returning is an anonymous type. So if you want nicer Swagger output, you'd probably want to give your return type a name. But anyway, just something to consider. So once we do this, let's just try it out. I actually kind of know something's going to go wrong here, but we can fix that up really quickly. And how are we doing on time? I heard we were shooting for like 45 minutes-ish. All right, yeah, so this time we get an exception. It claims that the anonymous type doesn't have an empty constructor. So yeah, I mean, that's just something to do with XML serializer.serializer expecting a constructor where the JSON thing doesn't. But for things that aren't anonymous types, it should work fine. So if we like say return that instead, we can try. Yeah, so there we get like today's weather in Seattle. So 35 degrees. Is that even like, you know what? I don't want to even look at my weather and show that's wrong because there's no way it's that cold. But it's coming from somewhere. Maybe it hasn't been, maybe I have the wrong coordinates. Maybe I should have had like a negative sign in there somewhere. Probably is exactly what it should have been. Anyway. All right. And then another thing to kind of note is if we reload the Swagger schema, we lose some information about the return value because instead of returning an object directly, we're returning this XML result of T, which like this minimal APIs doesn't really know. It should be using the T for the shape of the API. The other thing is like before it said that the response body was JSON. Now, you're just losing out on a lot of metadata. So that is something that we're trying to improve with some improvements to results in .NET 7. Like, there's actually some really cool ideas that Damian Edwards is working on right now to have static methods on this type. So you could do like, and basically get additional metadata about the endpoint. So like this content type being like application XML, we would be able to just infer from the XML result type. So if you wanted to look at stuff like that, like I'm reviewing a PR right now from Damian. It's about to be merged. Let's see, where is it at? He's got 2 big ones right now. Yeah, this is the one. So fun stuff. Yeah, this is using the new. I know this is supposed to be about .NET 6, not .NET 7, but in .NET 7 we have this crazy concept of static abstract interfaces, and this uses it. So pretty fun, and that's basically how this is going to work with this populate metadata via metadata provider. So this would be basically the interface that you would implement with your XML result. Could be fun. Yeah, I can talk about more things. There's a concept similar to try-parse that's like called bind async. So if you want to read something from the body, you could do that. You can kind of do custom model binding that way. I can talk about some future plans about things like filters and route groups and stuff. But yeah, I haven't heard anything for a while. I hope I haven't just been like talking to dead air.
Are we still here?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Intently. I already have some questions from the chat. I also have some questions from myself.
Perfect.
And the first one for me is, so since this is all in one big file and these handlers are right there as lambdas, right, to the map get and map post, what does unit testing this look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One thing that we worked hard to make happen, kind of sidestep the question really quick, is to make Web Factory work. So like for some simple microservices, right? Like I think doing like end-to-end testing is like okay in some scenarios. So Web Application Factory, for those of you who aren't aware, let me see if I could quickly show an example of that. I guess the easiest way would be to do this and then reload everything here. If it lets me. Okay, all right. But anyway, Web Application Factory. Maybe I can do it this way. All right. Yeah, so Web Application Factory in this case is, please tell me I did this in the right thing. Is going to be right in our test project here, hopefully. So this kind of shows you some ways that you can write tests with this. So in this case, we have like an API application, right? Which is basically a Web Application Factory program, where program is like, this implicitly defined class with your top level statements. And then what you can do, right, using that is you can change your environment to use like in-memory database, like mock services, that kind of stuff. And then you can make requests, look at the response body, check that if it's created, that you have like the expected response body, as a result, all of that. Now, I get the question was about unit tests, but I just wanted to show that like, yes, you can do integration tests, even though you don't have like kind of that old style Git host builder. So previously, like in that kind of the old example I was giving earlier, like this is why Create Host Builder existed, was for that MVC web application factory stuff. It's so we could get access to the host builder, inject those test mock services, and then run like kind of in memory test requests and all that kind of stuff. Now for unit tests, super valid point. Like as written, this is not really unit testable at all. That being said, if you wanted to, right, you can easily do like public static class, and you can put this in another file too, right? Like I'm just doing this here for quickness. You can do Tulu static class, my endpoints, right? You would have to like come up with a type for this, right? So like now that we're doing XML, it'd be somewhat easy. Like this could be a task of XML results of weather forecast or something like that. And then you could just do something. All right, and then it could be like, right. So you get the point. And then this suddenly becomes pretty unit testable. Now, does that? All right. So I'm got to clean up my syntax. This is a right. And like get async would now have to be defined as like a private method or something, and not like a local function in program main. But right, you could call get weather in a unit test and make sure you get like the right weather snapshot. And that would be my recommendation for larger apps where you want this. And then to attach it, right, there are a couple ways you can go about it. You might even do like a void add endpoints, endpoint route builder. And this would be, then you could do like endpoints dot map get this location. Right, and so now you can, without casting, this is another new C# feature, just like pass this directly. And then instead of doing like app.mapget, you could do like my endpoints dot, did I make this public? Nope. So it should have been internal before. Oh, it's just not static. That's the real problem. But it's a static class, but I'm sure that's why I was complaining. Yeah, right. So, and then this app, right, is both an endpoint route builder. That's kind of the relevant thing here. And it's an application builder. So you can add both like endpoints and middleware. So these things, like the use ones are usually middleware. Like these are all middleware, use cores, use Swagger UI, and the map stuff is all endpoints. And that technically runs as part of another middleware, which is called like app.use endpoints. And like normally this would take like your endpoint builder if you're like doing it in a startup based application, and then you could do some things. You can actually still use this to an extent with web application builder to control basically like exactly where in the middleware pipeline these callbacks get run.
Okay, so basically you pull them out of the code you had before, so you make them testable, and then you plug them back in using the code and using the static method you showed here.
Yeah. And so yeah, and like here is like an example of kind of doing that. So this is something that we did, or Sophia did for the build talk, which is like she extracted all the endpoints of the jobs app that we did into a service, and then in the unit tests just calls into the service. So basically the entire endpoint It's just like in a unit testable class.
Yep. So I guess that also answers the next question. It's like when the application starts to grow, right? When you get to the bigger applications and you get to I don't know, APIs that do CRUD and have 4 or 5 endpoints. Are there any patterns like evolving in the community, I guess, for how to do this best, how to structure this best? Because you're gonna move to separate files at some point, probably.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you know, you might end up doing that based on, you know, route groups or something, which is something going on in .NET 7. But like, you know, I think for each kind of prefix that you have, you know, which might have in the past been a controller, you might put all of those in like a single static class. But I will say that it's certainly a lot more flexible. Which some people like, and some people would like, no, I want there to be one true way to do things. I would rather know that, like, hey, if I see an ASP.NET Core project, I can look at the controllers folder, and that's where all of my endpoints are defined. So this basically would require you to look at program and like see, okay, like where is app being passed around, and like where are people adding endpoints. So it's a bit of difference there. So, you know, some people really like the freedom that gives you, and some people would be like, I just want a recommendation. And as of right now, we're leaning more towards freedom. I know we're working on some sort of like scaffolding stuff where you can like take a database or whatever, and, you know, generate a controller. You can do that today. We're trying to do similar thing for endpoints. And where we do that, you know, I think you point it to a table that creates its own static class, right? We're not just inserting code into an existing like program CS. As far as I know, like the plan is, at least for the endpoint definitions, those are in a different class, and then there's going to be like a one-line thing, kind of like what I showed, to attach the endpoints.
So we should be expecting some new stuff on this as well in .NET 7.
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be more patterns that you see, like as you do scaffolding and so forth, but I don't think that, you know, we're gonna force like a single way of doing things. Like you'll still be able to cram all of your endpoints in program CS if that's what you so desire.
Okay, cool, thanks. And Stefan, you had another nice one.
Well, one question and one thing about the latitude and longitude. The 0.0 was correct. It's called null island. I figured out. So
Okay.
it's a valid latitude and longitude value. The reason why your 100 and minus 100 didn't work is because that one is invalid. So
Yeah, well, I never claimed to be a geography expert.
no, but it was something I was just searching for. Well,
Yeah, and I don't even think my coordinates were Seattle. I think they were supposed to be Seattle, but I think I was missing a negative sign that whole time. But
oh well, that's okay.
East versus west, one of them's negative.
Oh, so so if our listeners or somebody who's watching this want to start with using minimal APIs, where do they start? Where can they go? Are there any resources with some demos, with some labs, or?
Okay. Look, I swear there's a pretty. So the overview that we have actually is pretty all right, I think. Yeah. So I mean, this includes a lot, and there are a lot of things that I didn't even get like into. Like configuration manager is pretty interesting in that it lets you like add configuration sources and immediately read from them. So like there's even an example of that. But yeah, so like I would recommend that. Like I don't know if everyone else's Google is like that, or if that's just me because you know I'm in it. But yeah, Google minimal APIs. That overview I think is pretty good. We worked on it, and you know there's that tutorial and stuff too. So yeah, see, we're doing weather things, but that's just like basically the the old Web API weather template.
Okay, cool. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, so Stefan, you showed us a whole lot of stuff in 45 or 40 or 45 minutes. Some of it kind of went too fast for me and went over my head, but the message is really clear, and I think it's a really nice evolution of like the old. Well, it shouldn't even be an evolution. It's like a full change up, but it's a really nice and cool new way to do stuff. So I really want to thank you for your time and your enthusiasm showing us minimal APIs. And I'd love to see you back maybe next year when we have new features and new stuff to show on it.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great. Who knows? Maybe we can bring more people along. It's a big like group effort. Like a lot of people have worked on this and made it what it is. So yeah, excited to show it off and have more people see it.
Awesome. Okay, thanks very much. We are taking a small break of about 5 minutes, and then at 8 p.m. our time, I'm not going to do the time difference here, we'll be back with Brigit Murtaugh for our talk on Visual Studio Code.
Yep. Correct. Well, thank you, Stefan.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
And there we are again. Hey, Roel.
Hi, nice to be back. So,
Yes,
did you see, because of our new streaming setup, we now have a nice video in the break without music.
without music, it was a very relaxing and zen moment for all of us.
Yep, we are gonna
So,
work on that.
yeah, we'll do. For now, it's fine. So let's bring in our next guest, Roel. And there she is already. Hi,
Hey,
Brigit.
everyone. Hey, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Brigit. So for our listeners, they already saw that we're going to talk about Visual Studio Code with the session Visual Studio Code Anywhere. But before we dive in, well, I was discussing it with Roel, and Roel and I had, well, most of the times we have a personal question about somebody, but we couldn't find anything what we could ask. But we do have one question before we start. So you are a program manager at Microsoft, and well, basically we were wondering what does a program manager does?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like even day to day, it can vary a lot. So there's no set thing of, oh, every day, every week, I'm going to do this. But it can be anywhere from working with customers to defining what the future of our product looks like, to analyzing data, running experiments, doing social outreach, like talks like this. So it's really cool, multifaceted, working with a ton of different teams and partners.
Cool. Okay, a lot of different things. Okay. Well, let's just start with your session. You already have your screen shared, so we will bring that in, and you can start.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, again, my name is Brigit Murtaugh, and I'm a PM on the VS Code team here at Microsoft. So I have just a couple of slides to set some context, and then we're going to hop into a bunch of demos, because everyone loves seeing code and things working live. So let's get into it. So what does it mean to use VS Code anywhere? Let's see, I point there. Yeah, took 2 clicks. All right. So there's a couple of motivations that I think it's helpful to understand or get context on. So over the past few years on our team, and really, I think just in general, we've noticed that there's an increasingly remote world that we're in. So for instance, folks may be working on a really large code base or huge monorepo that doesn't fit on their local machine, or maybe has security requirements that are not allowed to copy it to their local machine. There's also a lot more investment in machine learning and data science, which can be really compute or GPU intensive. And there's developments of new technologies like the Windows subsystem for Linux, or WSL, which actually gives you a real Linux kernel on a Windows machine. And with this increasingly remote world, we saw there were different solutions, but we felt like it would be great to provide an even better or more robust experience. So what does that look like? It means having access to your source code really seamlessly in your editor without having to constantly download or re-upload or zip things or anything like that. Really making sure it feels seamless, getting the full experience that you would expect of maybe syntax highlighting and completions or extensions, and not being restricted to just one kind of environment. So not just being restricted to accessing a machine through an SSH terminal or something like that, really being able to develop where you want. So with this in mind, we actually developed these remote development extensions. So developed a couple of times there, but what do they look like? So there's a handful. And so there's remote WSL, which lets you work in that full Linux distro on Windows. There's remote containers, which allows you to work in what's known as development containers or dev containers, which really provide a separate environment on your machine. And there's remote SSH, which lets you access a remote desktop machine or a remote virtual machine to access source code there, toolkits, libraries, or even actually debug and run against the compute there. And there's GitHub code spaces, which there is an extension for in VS Code, but it's also a web UI or a web tool as well. So it's an entire service. And that provides you Microsoft managed compute. So that way you can have access to more compute or other tool sets and things like that. So in addition to these remote development extensions, something else that was top of mind for our team is being able to develop in the browser. So you might not be aware, but the VS Code team's original vision was actually to build a development tool that could run fully serverless in the browser. And as of about October last year, we released VS Code for the web, which you can access today at vscode.dev, that URL there. It gives you a VS Code experience that you don't have to download or switch to the desktop to use, a VS Code experience running fully in the browser. And so that really helps us in our mission. This session was titled VS Code Anywhere. So it helps us in that mission of using VS Code Anywhere to edit anything. So with that context and those tools in mind, let's get into some demos and see what it looks like. I'm going to exit out of PowerPoint. There may be a quick moment where I need to switch over here. And all right, you should be able to edge now. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and start off our journey in the web, because here you see I'm on Edge. Let's start in the browser. So all I have to do is I can say vscode.dev. And once that loads up, I'm going to see that this looks like VS Code that I would use in the desktop. But it's really neat because I didn't have to install anything or set anything else up. And it's going to load very quick. We're going to get the types of views and activity bar that we're used to. And let's see what we can actually do. So we see to begin with, we have these options to open a folder or open something recent. And so with that, we actually have the option to work on local files or projects on our machine, as long as you're in a browser that has access to the File System Access API. So for instance, Edge or Chrome. You're also able to work on repositories or source code hosted elsewhere. So let's go ahead and take a look at both of those experiences. So I, for instance, have an HTML project on my local machine that I've been working on. And something that we actually just added in this last VS Code release is the ability to drag and drop into vscode.dev. So what I could do is let's just drag this over here from my local machine. I could have also said open folder. And now I'm going to be able to look at these files. So I can do some really quick editing in the browser, get access to browser-based tools or debugging, things like that. So let's go ahead and take a look. If I open up the README, for instance, we're going to see that it's a pretty small README, but it's going to look just like typical Markdown. And then, for instance, if I open up the actual code of the site, I'll see that I'm getting syntax highlighting and completions. And there's different levels of language support in the browser, depending on the language. But for these webby languages, HTML and CSS and JavaScript, the experience in the browser is going to feel very similar to the experience in desktop VS Code. So let's say I wanted to change the color of the header on my website. What I could do is I see that code is here, and I can click on this. I get this cool color picker like I do in desktop VS Code, and I could just go ahead and drag it to, I think this like red-orange color looks nice. I'm prompted to save my changes, so I'll do that. And then let's go ahead and see if the change took effect. We can see this is the website I'm developing. Boom, change took effect. So that's awesome. So I'm able to have this quick experience in the browser. Don't have to switch context. Can stay right here. Maybe have these in a split window or split tab. And we'll also see that we have some other views over here. So for instance, search, we'll get multi-file search. So if I go here, we'll see all my results. And you also have the option to turn on indexing for even more accurate multi-file search. So now we've seen what it looks like to work on a local project or some local files. So what does it look like to work on source code hosted elsewhere, like I had mentioned? So if I go over to another project that I've been working on, it's actually hosted in GitHub. So it's not copied on my local machine or cloned on my local machine. What I can do is, we'd previously seen the option to open a remote project in VS Code Dev. But this cool thing that I can do is I can go to any GitHub repo and just prepend VS Code Dev to the front of it, / and we're going to see that it loads up in that VS Code editor in the browser. And so once it loads up, we're going to see the files that were on GitHub, and we're going to be able to work with them. And similarly, we're going to be able to search across the files, commit back changes via source control, and even get certain experiences or extensions that we want through the extensions view like we normally would. And I will just preface this. I think the screen sharing is taking up a little bit of bandwidth on my machine, but usually if you go and try this out on your own, it's going to load up pretty instantly. It's just taking a little bit of time to activate some extensions here with the screen sharing. That is okay. And so we can see then that'll populate with extensions that we can look through. We'll be able to commit back here with source control. And if we'd wanted to, we can click on this GitHub icon and we'll be able to do some other things like go to other repos on GitHub or in other source control providers. So now that we have our code loaded up here, let's take a look. I can click on the README. So this one has a bit more of a robust README than the last repo that we were looking at. And what I can do is I can even preview it like I would in desktop VS Code. Sometimes I don't always remember what the markdown syntax exactly is or how it'll look. So this is a really handy feature. And then let's say I want to make a change. I like that there's an exclamation mark here, but I want to feel even more excited about my project. I can hit that. We'll see that it's marked as modified. And now in the source control view, I can go ahead and just commit this back. And we'll see that it tells me my changes are going to be committed and immediately pushed to the branch I'm currently working on. So there's no additional staging, syncing, pushing after this commit. It's just going to be an automatic commit and push to my repo. So we'll say add excitement. Go with that. And then we can just go ahead and commit that in. Cool. So now let's say that let's take a step back and let's also take a look at the URL that we have, for instance, here in the browser. We can see that it's VS Code dev /GitHub and then / my repo's name on GitHub. And the cool thing is VS Code dev is going to deliver us these customized experience through these different routes or URLs. So routes is what we call them. And so what other routes are there? There's actually a handful, and we are increasing the number looking at like what other experiences we could provide through routes. So if I go over here, we're going to see that this is a theme that I'm interested in. And it'd be cool if maybe there was a way to just easily grab a theme when I'm in the browser and exploring it in the marketplace. But there actually is a way. And so we have /theme routes in VS Code Dev, which allows you to preview a theme. So maybe if you want to look at different themes before committing to one, you can totally do that. And we also have this ability where you can preview in VS Code Dev to your extension READMEs. So I'll go ahead and say preview in VS Code.dev. And we're going to see now following /theme instead of /GitHub. And we're going to see the theme identifier. So you also don't have to go from the marketplace. If you know a theme identifier or copy clipboard, you can just go ahead and follow the same format. And it's going to go ahead and actually give us a couple of files that we can explore. And it's a kind of try things out. And so that's really something neat to think about in VS Code Dev as you stay completely in the browser. You can experiment with extend themes, lightweight code changes and edits, exploring new repos. There's a lot of different opportunities there. And screen sharing seems to, again, make it think a little bit more, but we'll get there. It's just a little bit of excitement or anticipating up. And there we go. We can see that it's installing it and going to set that up. Usually this is pretty instant. It takes like 1 or 2 seconds to go ahead and do that. And we can also see that another indicate environment that we're working on, similar to how we have /theme for the that we're working with specifically a theme extension, we can also see in the lower left, now it says theme tester playground. So that's another cool customized experience and a little bit of an indication of what kind of environment that you're working in. All right, there we go. Now it's loading up, so we can see that I didn't have any of the with. These are just some preview files that are provided through that preview extension for looking at themes. All right, we're loaded up here, and now it's going to refresh, and we can see the theme changed. And we're also prompted that we can either keep this theme if we like it, and it's like, oh, this looks cool, I want to keep using it, or you don't have to keep it. So that way you don't bog down your extension list with additional extensions if you want to keep it clean and lighter. And so now we've seen that we can use a variety of extensions, like with working with GitHub or looking at themes and theme extensions. But there's even more possibilities in the web for what we can do. So let's take a look at what some of those look like. So on the VS Code team, we do a lot of tracking and issue management through notebooks, and specifically through GitHub Issues notebooks is one of the ways that we can look at what issues are assigned to us for this milestone and what should I work on right now. So I have one of our notebooks here. Go take a look. This is public in the VS Code repo. And I'm going to go ahead and now, instead of vscode.dev, I'm actually going to add insiders.vscode.dev to the URL. And so this is something else that's cool to note. You can actually use either stable code through vscode.dev, or you can access the latest insiders bits through insiders.vscode.dev. And for anyone who may be new to the VS system, we ship an insiders version for like new features and quick testing of things pretty much daily. So pretty much every single day you can get a new version of code with the latest features and fixes and experiments. It's still very stable though. But if you'd rather just stick on the core stable releases, you can also just use stable code. And that goes for both the desktop and the web with insiders.vscode.dev. And you'll be able to switch it through the gear icon. So you'll also be able to, I believe at least, but either way, you can switch it through this URL here. And so this is going to be a little bit of build up too. So while I think that loads up, I'll go ahead and also load up another URL at the same time. Here is, this is just another project, and this is going to have a few other interesting web extension experiences. So I'm going to go to vscode.dev/ and load that up. And we'll see. All right, now it's loading up here. Again, this is a demo instance. I ran through this a bunch of times before, and it always loads in like a couple of seconds. But it's okay. It's just a little bit more anticipation during the actual presentation. Then that one will load up too. But I think something else that's worth covering while this goes ahead and loads up is we're talking about different extensions that provide these unique experiences. And something to note is that certain extensions are going to work automatically in vscode.dev. So for instance, theme extensions and snippets and grammars, those will pretty much work automatically. But for extensions that maybe have a little bit more code or a little more complexities or dependencies, you'll want to go ahead and take some steps to web enable them. And so I'll provide this link at the end, but we do have a web extension off checkout, which will give you just a rundown of here's the anatomy of an extension, what makes it work in the web, and how you can ensure that your experiences work in the web too. So that way users can go ahead and try out and use yours in the web as well. All right, so I think this loaded up here. Cool. So we can see our notebook, is code repo. So what I can do is I can just hit run, and then we'll see the output. So that one just got like our date established, and then we can actually see different issues and click on them and explore them in GitHub. So it's a really cool integration. And this is through an extension known as the GitHub Issues Notebook extension. And that also works in desktop VS Code. So you can totally use it in either environment. Now, if I go over here, that one is still give it a little bit of time. But I had also mentioned that there's levels of language support in the browser. And that is through an experience known as AnyCode, which is built on TreeSitter. And so we also have a little bit more of information about that in our web docs, which I'll link to at the end. But if you're interested in AnyCode, the extension is also here, which you can learn about. All right, let's see how this is doing. Maybe we'll come back to that at the end when time to load up a little more. It'll be a little bit of a cliffhanger. But okay, these different experiences in the browser, and something to note with them is that they don't actually have access to your machine's compute. So for instance, if I open up a terminal, we're going to see that terminals are not available in the web editor. And to use one, we actually need to switch to another environment that has compute. So in the browser, you get a ton of functionality, but it is still a light version of VS Code. So there will be some limitations. So if I click continue working on, what happens? Let's see. I could say continue working on, and I get two different options. I can either clone the repo that I'm working on locally and continue working on it on desktop, or I can create a new code space. So that's going to lead us into the next service we're going to take a look at, which is GitHub Code Spaces. And if I click here, we're going to see that I get the option to choose how big of a remote machine I want to use. So I'll just go ahead and use the default that was suggested. And now it's telling me that we're creating a code space. And so it's nice to be able to transition seamlessly between VS Code for the web and code spaces in the case of, hey, maybe you were initially looking at some extensions, doing some lightweight code review and code changes in vscode.dev. And then you'd actually like to go ahead and test out those changes and maybe run them or do some other debugging. And so then you can transition over to a code space and get that full experience with compute. And we'll also see here that Codespaces is taking time to build a container. And so we can get customized experiences further through Codespaces by setting up what tools and languages and runtimes should be included in the Codespaces VM. If you don't specify any specific development container, Codespaces uses what's known as its kitchen sink dev container, or its kitchen sink image. And that's going to include a variety of tool sets like Python, .NET, Java, pretty much all those kinds of things, where it's kind of a catch-all for different kinds of development you might want to use. But we can also specify specifically what type of environment we want to use through this .dev container folder. And so I had mentioned dev containers a little bit at the beginning when I talked about the remote containers extension, but dev containers essentially allow us to define this custom environment. And so if I click on .dev container, I'll see there's a couple of files. So I'll see that there's this file called dev container.json. And what this file does is it essentially tells our VS Code environment how to go ahead and spin up and connect to a development container. So we'll see it includes a variety of information, for instance, like the version of language we're using or a name to use for the container. So for instance, Python 3. And then we can set a variety of other things too. So for instance, we can determine settings to automatically include in the container. So for instance, let's go ahead and try this again, because it looks like our screen sharing maybe got to our code space as well. All right, let's see. Give that a chance. Let's go ahead and refresh it. Maybe just a good refresh is what it needed to work today for us. But as we go through the dev container, we're going to see there's different ways that you can really customize your environment with what you need, whether it is specific languages or tools, or if it's just things that make your development environment feel more like your own and more comfortable to you. And so we can see some of these things here, like different Python pathing. It's not always very fun to have to go through setting all that up. So the fact that our dev container can set that up for us automatically is really nice. And then this goes more into sometimes what you want for your own development experience. And so we include the Python and Pylance extensions by default. But if there's always a theme you wanted to use, for instance, you could also go ahead and set that up in extensions. And it's automatically going to be installed in our code space when we build it and get started. And something else that's cool that's worth noting is we have this post create command option. And that allows us to run commands right after the container is created. So in a Python case, for instance, oftentimes we'll want to go ahead and install a requirements.txt file. So we can see that already happened, and we don't have to do it manually. So there's a variety of lifecycle scripts like post create command that allow us to run different commands and set things up so we don't have to remember to do that manually. And if other folks are working on this project, they also don't have to know or remember to do those things by hand. So we've taken a look at the dev container JSON, which is this metadata file. And now I could go ahead and take a look at our Docker file. And so if you're familiar with Docker container-based development at all, this might look just like a standard Docker file to you. But we can see that we set, for instance, what image, which is essentially what is our container environment going to look like. So I'm pulling here from the Microsoft Container Registry, or MCR, and I can specifically choose a Python variant depending on the version I want. And I can also run some other commands and setup through the Docker file too. And what's cool as well is I really don't need to be a Docker or Linux expert to configure these things or to add them. Codespaces and VS Code overall make it really simple. If I just click on Codespaces, I'll see that there's this add development container configuration files. I'll continue real quick without overwriting it, but we can see we get a bunch of different options. So we can see we get ones for Python because the extension is actually pretty smart in that it knows, hey, this looks like a Python project. Maybe you want a Python dev environment. So you can go ahead and add that. And maybe if Python isn't what you want, you can continue looking at other definitions through show all definitions and really get a whole variety. But since I already have my dev container files, I won't do that right now. And so let's see, now when I go ahead and open up the terminal, we're going to see that it is actually just a normal terminal. And so for instance, I could check what version of Python I have, and I could run other commands. It's going to feel just like working on a machine where I would normally have access to compute. I go over here, I'm going to see I can also run in debug. So again, this is different than what you can do in VS Code for the web. And I'll have my different options. And let's go ahead and run our app. I'll click run here. And we're going to see the terminal output come. We're going to see up here our debugging dialog there. And now it says our app is running. So let's go ahead and click on it and see what happens. Let's say follow link. Hopefully it uses this browser. It does, great. And Codespaces is going to take care of things like port forwarding for us as well. So that way we don't have to worry about, oh, how do I get my Codespace to access localhost or another domain or something? It's just going to take care of that for you. So we can see we went from localhost to this domain, all super seamless. And this is the output we were expecting. So VS Code and Codespaces can do that. All this development environment setup, yes, it can. Awesome. And now let's see if our other VS Code dev window actually loaded up here. I think it was this one. Cool. Okay, this is these are extensions at play. And so we can see this is a way to get even a little bit more functionality or like running capabilities out of VS Code Dev. So this uses a couple of extensions. It uses one known as CodeSwing, which gives us this ability to work with like HTML and JavaScript files to preview them here directly in our editor. And it also uses this extension known as CodeTour. So we can actually set certain points in a repo or a code base. And this is helpful in a variety of settings. So if someone's onboarding to your project, you could set up a code tour. So that way they can see the most important parts or run certain commands automatically. And in an educational setting, it's really helpful too. A professor could go ahead and set this up, so that students see where they should work on code or add or edit it. But, all right, so now we have seen VS Code for the web. We've seen how it can have a variety of functionality, previewing, working on files. And we've seen Codespaces too, which gives us just that of access to compute and even more extensions as well, because extensions don't have to be web enabled to work, even if you are working in a browser like this. So I'll go ahead and stop my app. And now when we think about the title of this presentation, VS Code Anywhere, we also think about, well, of course I'm going to want to use VS Code on the desktop at some point, right? Or it's very likely I would, the original location of VS Code. And so what are some examples of how I might want to use that in not just a typical local development setting or flow? And so here we talked all about this .dev container folder and how we can use development containers to onboard people easily to a project, to run commands automatically for us, just give us the right pre-configured environment whenever we need it. So we can actually use dev containers in local or desktop VS Code as well. So let's see what that looks like. So here I am in this Python project that I was in Codespaces, and I can actually go ahead and just open it up in GitHub as well. And so we're going to the files here. We're going to set this option to use remote containers to open it up. And remote containers is that extension that I mentioned at the beginning in the slide deck that allows you to use development containers on your local machine. You can actually also access development containers on a remote machine, but you can do it either way. And you can develop in that environment as long as you have a .dev container folder or a dev container JSON. So let's see what this button does. I'll go ahead and click on it. And we're going to see that I'm prompted to open VS Code. And we actually have the code available where you can go ahead and add these buttons to your own repos as well. Looks like VS Code opened in my other window. So I'll open it up here. And as it loads up, we're going to see that it feels like a similar setup to how we were working in Codespaces, but now it's on our desktop VS Code. So we don't have to, for instance, have access to a browser or access to internet or have to use external compute if we don't want to. We can keep everything on the machine. So now I'm getting prompted to open the URI from before. So I'll open that up. We have some anticipation. We'll see, hopefully this goes a little bit faster with the screen sharing than some of the VS Code dev experiences did. And what this is actually going to do is it's going to take that repo that we had in the browser, that Python repo, and it's going to clone that in what's known as a container volume. So when working with containers, there's a couple of different ways to store files and manage storage and those kinds of things. And a volume is one of the more efficient ones. It's managed by Docker. It's not as manual. It's going to be faster operation. So this is going to clone us in a volume automatically. Let's see. when it does it. And we're also going to see that in desktop, we're going to have access to the remote indicator, for instance, like we saw in VS Code Dev or like we saw in Codespaces. And clicking on that is going to give us access to commands through the remote development extensions. All right, cool. So we can see that it automatically refreshed. I think all these experiences are maybe just a little shy on this demo today, and that is okay. They'll be faster when you try them yourself. Cool. So we can see now that it's telling us in the lower left what's happening. It's opening up a remote, and we can also see that it's starting our dev container. And we could always check out the log if we were interested in what's happening. And once it does that, we're going to be able to see our different files here in the left. And it's going to feel like right now, as I'm opening this up and as I'm waiting for files to, it feels pretty similar to like a normal local desktop VS Code experience, but it's actually separate in the sense, or remote in the sense that it provides a different set of tool sets than may be available on my local machine. Give this a moment to start up. And it's funny too, because I could have had this maybe in VS Code already, but I figured, it's fast. It's so fast. I'll just load it up live for us. But the screen sharing part made it a little bit different, and that's okay. And it's also worth noting that in these remote experiences, like through remote containers, other remote extensions, like I had mentioned, like remote WSL or remote SSH, you really get access to the full VS Code experience that you're used to. So you're still going to be able to search, you're still going to be able to run and debug, but it's going to run and debug in that custom or isolated or remote environment. So in the remote containers case, it's going to run and debug using the tool sets or debuggers that are set up in the development container. Whereas in like remote SSH, for instance, it's going to run and debug on that virtual machine or on that remote desktop that you're working on. And maybe as this loads up, I don't know if we do any questions live or if there's any questions at this point that could be interesting to help us facilitate this loading. Wait for this to load.
Hi, Brigit. Sorry. I'm unmuted, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about vscode.dev. So what you're showing us now, there is a folder in your repository, and I guess that's where you can store stuff. But when you just did the vscode.dev thing and you showed us the theme playground, you said, well, what if you decide you want to keep using this theme? So if you do that, where does that information go? How does it know to use that theme the next time you want to use vscode.dev?
It cut out a little bit there, but basically, like, how do you keep it so you use it the next time you're in vscode.dev? Was that the question?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so if I go ahead and I say keep, for instance, I can click keep, and what that's going to do is it's actually going to install the extension. So right now it's just kind of like previewing the theme extension, but if I say keep, it'll be installed, and vscode.dev, if I access it now from the same, it's going to have that theme automatically set for me. So that way I can bring in the environment that I tried out and I was like, oh, cool, I like this.
Okay, so and that goes for other extensions as well, I think. So
yeah, so this is all going to be stored in a cache. That way it's remembered, hey, like I had these extensions installed. So if you use them in the same browser, then you'll have them there. And even if you go to a different browser or a different machine, you can sync your extensions through settings sync in VS Code. So for instance, if I click, this one's now refreshing, but if I go over here and I say min on settings sync, do that, I can see I can sync a variety of things. So extensions, settings, UI state, and I can do that across VS Code Dev instances, but that'll also just go for any instance in VS Code. So it can go into Codespaces, it can go into desktop VS Code.
That's nice. And I already had another question written down, so I guess I'll just ask since we're we're waiting for the dev container to spin up, right?
Yes.
So you showed us a Docker file before, and when I guess when you open the code space, it builds a new container image, and then it starts it based on that Docker file and the dev container JSON file together. So would it also be possible to use a Docker image instead of what's in this Docker file right now? So what I'm imagining is there is developer number 1 comes in, he runs this in a code space, and at that point, the Python version is 1. I don't know, 2, whatever. And then 2 days later, developer 2 comes in, and then by that time, the configuration has changed, and now it's working in Python 3. And now the 2 developers are in different kind of environments. So would it be possible to pre-build one of these container images and then use that instead of building it when you open the code space?
Yeah, so if you want to make any changes to your container or your environment while you're in here, you could totally do that. Like if I didn't want 3 bullseye and I just deleted the bullseye, you could go ahead and do that, hit save, and it'll just show up as a change normally in the SCM view or the source control view. And Codespaces also prompts us. It says, hey, we've noticed there's a change in your configuration. You should rebuild to apply it now. So depending on how permanently you want to apply this change, either you could just rebuild the environment now and get the new version of the tools that you set up, or you could also rebuild, but then commit to source control. So that way the Docker file has the latest version that you set up, and you or anyone else using this project in the future will have the latest version.
Okay, cool.
But you always have to rebuild it, so you don't have a ready-to-use, ready-to-go image. It's being rebuilt.
Yeah, you'll need to rebuild it. And so sometimes I've been there where you make a change and it's like, oh, why isn't this tool set here? Why is this version still that? And it's just, oh yeah, do a rebuild. And it shouldn't be too time consuming, especially depending on how the Docker file is laid out. There should be some optimizations of not having to rebuild every single layer or part, but the change will take effect.
Cool.
And then I guess as a next question, would you also be able to share those extensions across your team so that all developers are using the same set of extensions or something like that?
Yeah, so the extensions array that we have in here that lists right now Python and Pylance, but I could add any number of extensions that I want. Those are going to be made available to goes ahead and uses this definition. So when anyone else creates a code space or uses remote containers locally and opens up this repository, they're going to see, oh, cool, like these extensions are already there. And so that's a neat way to make sure that your team also has all the specific setup that they need. And something else that's cool is if I click on extensions, if it takes a moment to load up here, what I can say, right click, and I can say add to dev container JSON. And so that's a really seamless way. You don't have to copy paste or know the ID. You can just easily be like, oh yeah, I want this in my definition.
Awesome, cool stuff. I don't have another question right now, but
that is okay. Let's see how this is doing. Perfect. All right. That was perfect timing. Got all the questions out and this finished loading up. So that's great. So now I'm going to see in the lower left that instead of saying GitHub or instead of saying code spaces, like we saw in vscode.dev or code spaces, now it's specifically going to give us information about the remote environment that we're working in VS Code. So I can see it says in a dev container. So that's going to show up for any time that I'm using the remote containers extension. And I'm going to see specifically the name of dev container. So if we remember, if we click on dev container JSON, we set a name here, Python 3, which is helpful since this is a Python 3 dev container. But if I wanted something else that would be even more helpful to me or my team, I could totally change that name and commit it back, and then the change will take effect. And so let's make sure that this is set up properly. And so, for instance, I should be looking at like a Python 3.9 version. So let's make sure that I have that. And opening this terminal, I'm specifically developing now in this development container. So I'm not looking at dependencies or tools or languages that are installed on the rest of my local machine. I'm just isolated to this container environment. So I can say Python version. Let's see, I have Python 3.9.10, and I think that's different than my local Python version. So let's go ahead and take a look. The Windows terminal. It's okay. Every app that I open is a little bit shy. All right, cool. And once I'm able to type in here, we'll have the moment of, is this the same environment? Is this a different environment? Let's see. Maybe yes, maybe no. Cool, there we go. Python version. Cool, so now we already see there's this difference of just if I open up a regular terminal and check out what's installed on my ordinary local machine, I see I have Python 3.9.7, but in this dev container, I have a different version of Python. And this change may seem minor because it's just like a subversion or a minor version of Python, but we can get into some really cool scenarios where if I didn't even have Python installed on my local machine, I could still develop Python applications using a development container in the remote containers extension. So that's really neat. And it shows that you're also not just restricted to working in the browser or using a code space and remote compute. You can keep all of this on your local computer. It is worth noting that you do need to have Docker installed for the remote containers extension to work. So as long as that's installed and running, you can use this extension and freely try out different kinds of development environments. So if I go over here, we're going to see, of course, the terminal is working. Now run and debug is working as normal. And we're going to see it looks pretty similar to the Codespaces one. So I can run it and it'll go ahead and open up or start that app for me. And if you do any sort of Python development locally, you're going to see, hey, like the files pretty much look the same. The run experience pretty much looks the same. And that's because it really is the seamless VS Code experience, no matter where you work or anywhere you work. And so now we see, yeah, it loaded up at that same port. And we can also see both in Codespaces and in local VS Code. It takes care of port forwarding for us. We can look at the ports view, take a look at what processes are there, and we could even modify specifically what port that we wanted an app to run on. And it also prompts you that your app is running on that port, so you can go ahead and check it out. So I'll go ahead and stop that for now. And so if I go over here to this Remote Explorer, this is another cool way that we can kind of navigate around the Remote Containers extension and our other remote experiences. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here we basically are going to have a list of our containers and our list of dev volumes. And as I was mentioning before, volumes are just a different way that we can store our source code and that kind of thing and manage our containers. And we're going to be able to look at different details on our containers as well. And it's also worth noting that remote containers is a different extension than the Docker extension in VS Code. The Docker extension also lets you manage, start, work on, connect to containers, but it's kind of in the more typical sense if you're deploying your app to a containerized environment or something like that. But also in the Docker extension, if you have your list of containers in the Docker view, you can right-click on it and you can attach VS Code to one of them. And then that'll use the remote containers extension and allow you to develop within it. So there's a lot of different ways that we can interact with these different kind of environments. Cool. So we can see, for instance, like our list of volumes loaded up. And so we could explore them. We could remove them if they're unused. So for instance, we have this option, remove unused volumes. So it really tries to help you be conscious of, yes, this is your local machine. It's not a remote one. So let's clean it up. Let's make sure it's not using extra resources it may not need to. And maybe one of these will load up a little bit faster. But as I had mentioned, there's some other remote experiences beyond remote containers or code spaces. And so, for instance, there's the remote SSH extension. So you can see here I have a list of VMs that I've used to test out different apps or do some different development. And it's really cool because it's going to look just like this remote containers extension, but instead of using my local compute in a container, it'll be I'm connected through SSH. And similarly, I could view my Codespaces targets if I wanted to. So those Codespaces I was working on in the browser, I can also view them in desktop VS Code and even develop on them here. So maybe if you prefer desktop development or there's some key bindings or certain extensions or functionality that just works better in desktop for you, you can totally use the Codespaces extension in VS Code Desktop. And finally, we'll see that we also have this Wsl View of Targets. And so WSL is pretty neat. So I'll show you just a quick demo here. So we can see that I use this Ubuntu distro. And if you're maybe not using Linux a lot, or if you have used Linux, but you've had to do kind of like different partitioning or setting up Linux manually on your machine, you'll see that being able to use WSL and remote WSL in VS Code is super seamless. So for instance, I can go ahead and I can close out this remote connection. And so whenever you're in a remote environment in VS Code, you can get out of it really easily by just saying close remote connection. And then let's go ahead and see what it looks like to even just spin up a quick WSL window. And so we'll click on open a remote window. We'll see all our different options from the different remote extensions. And I'm going to say new WSL window. I can say using distro, and that allows me to specifically select if I have multiple WSL distros installed. It's really easy to get distros. You just go to the Microsoft Store. You can select Ubuntu and different versions of Ubuntu. You can get Debian. So there's a ton of different options there. But what this is going to do is it's going to, once my extensions activate, it'll prompt me one of those distros to use. It automatically detects them, so I don't have to like add them to VS Code or do any other special steps or syncing. And then it's going to automatically connect me to that WSL system. So similar to Codespaces, which provided the isolated VM that I can work on and have just different tool sets there. And similar to Dev Containers, where it's on my local machine, but it's still separate from the other tool sets I have. WSL lets us do that. So not only is it great for if you want to run Linux-based apps and do Linux debugging and those kinds of things just from a Windows machine, you can also then have specific tool sets in that environment. So if I just wanted, again, a certain version of Python, I could totally have that in my WSL distro without affecting or contaminating anything on the rest of my local machine. So we'll see that I have this Ubuntu 1804 distro. I'll select it. VS Code is going to pop open with a new window that is going to let me do some remote WSL development. We'll load this up here. And again, we can see that it says opening remote. To point out with WSL is there are kind of two different file systems you can use to access your work. And so you can use what's basically known as a mount, which automatically brings over your source code from the Windows side into the WSL system. But that mount isn't quite as performant as the other file system option, which is literally just a Linux file system in WSL. So you can specifically store files over on the WSL side, and that's going to give you faster performance and access and those kinds of things. So we definitely recommend storing your files on the Linux side. And then this will pop up, and we'll be able to do some development in yet another environment. And it's cool, too, because if you have the Windows terminal preview, you can go ahead and take a look at different environments that you have in the terminal. So for instance, this is one of mine, the Ubuntu terminal. So I can also access things through there. But rather than only being able to access them through the terminal or being restricted in that sense, I can totally use my VS Code environment that I'm used to. And then I get access to the same UI and the same extensions, those kinds of things too. All right. Nice. And so now we can see in the lower left here, rather than dev containers, it says WSL. And so now it says WSL. If I was in SSH, it would say SSH and then my VM or desktop name, and then the distro that I'm working on. So that's a nice way to remember what I'm working on. Let's go ahead. And so now this terminal looks a little bit different than the other terminals we might have looked at. And that's because this is specifically a terminal for this distro. So I'm basically working on Ubuntu, even though I just went and grabbed an Ubuntu distro from the Microsoft Store. So it's been a very easy experience. Just to see where we're working, I'll say uname, and it says Linux. So even though I'm on a Surface Book, it thinks that I'm on Linux when I'm working through Remote WSL, which is awesome. But those were the main demos I had. Thank you to everyone for sticking through that. It's always a little bit of an adventure, screen sharing things. So just some final resources that I wanted to share with folks. We definitely recommend and would love for you to check out VS Code for the web. You can just go to vscode.dev. Super easy. We'd love to hear your feedback and see what use cases you think of for it. And then for documentation, I have a couple of links listed here. So you can check out our docs specifically for VS Code Dev at vscode-web-docs. You can also look at that guide that I showed earlier of how to convert your extensions to web-enabled extensions. And that third link under docs is our documentation on the remote experiences. So for remote containers and remote WSL, remote SSH, you can totally check that out. And we'd love to hear your feedback. So whether it's on Twitter, I've included my Twitter handle here, if it's at the code account, or if you have a specific issue or feature request, you can totally file one either for remote at that first issues link, or for overall VS Code or vscode.dev at the regular VS Code repo. So thank you so much for your time.
Cool. Thank you. Impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really cool to see like how far things have come, and no matter where you want to develop, you can find a way to do that with VS Code, it feels like.
I have questions.
I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so I was just looking at the experience you get when you are on GitHub and you just press the period on your keyboard and you go to github.dev, right?
Mhm.
And that also looks like VS Code online. So how does that relate to VS Code.dev itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that github.dev experience is basically like a customized version or a subset of VS Code.dev. And so you can see that it's tightly integrated into GitHub because you can just hit the period key on any repo or add github.dev before any repo, and it's going to load up there. And it's going to have a couple of experiences that are maybe more specific to GitHub development. So it'll have like the GitHub theme installed, for example, by default, and set that. And so you can totally use either experience, but VS Code.dev also gives you access to other source control providers. So for instance, you can work on Azure repos and things hosted elsewhere in VS Code.dev, which you wouldn't be able to do in GitHub.dev. And VS Code.dev also has those additional custom routes. So with GitHub.dev, it's all going to be like /GitHub for those repos. But in VS Code.dev, we already saw a few when we saw /GitHub, but also /Azure repos works and /theme. And there's a /liveshare route. Liveshare is another popular extension in VS Code, which lets you do co-editing on a project at the same time. So there's a ton of other opportunities for extensibility there.
Did you have a question, Stefan?
Yes. So I'm really impressed with the code spaces, but what do I need for code spaces? Do I need a certain subscription, or is it? I think it's pay as you go, but
yeah, on the Codespaces doc site, they'll list like the billing model, for instance, but I believe you need a GitHub Teams or Enterprise account to be able to get access. So for instance, if you're in an org or a company that's interested in using Codespaces, you could totally talk to your team or company about that if you're maybe in one of those GitHub categories.
okay. Yeah, I'm still processing all the information. I think it's really cool, especially the dev containers, the remote containers, the way to use Docker on your local machine, and just create your development environment. Yeah, it's really impressive.
I have a question. Maybe it's annoying. I don't know, but this is the VS Code Anywhere talk, right? But my question is, does any of this work for Visual Studio, like full Visual Studio as well?
I believe Visual Studio does have some remote debugging and running options. So I believe if you look up like remote debugging or development with VS, you'll see, I think they can use WSL, and I think there is different integration with containers, for instance, but it's not through the same extensions. The extensions that I showed today work in just VS Code.
And so you open the code space. Sorry, I just keep going. you open the code space on GitHub through, I think it was just a code button and then open code space, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that you can open code spaces. So the way that I think I showed was when you're in vscode.dev working on a GitHub repo, you can say continue working on, which is a command from the command palette, or a button that's going to show up in your terminal or your run and debug. And it's going to give you the option to continue working in a code space on that same project. But you can also create code spaces. There's a green code drop-down button on the main page of any repo that you can click on that green code drop-down, and there'll be a cloud tab that lets you open up or start a code space And then if you also just go to github.com/codespaces, you can see any code spaces that you've created and manage them there.
And would this also work for Azure DevOps repositories?
So Codespaces is just for GitHub projects. And so you'll want to use one of the other remote options or one of the other web options like vscode.dev if you want to work on Azure repos.
I just think this is so cool.
It is.
I did finish my round of questions, I think.
Great.
Are there any other questions from the chat, maybe?
No, I haven't seen any other questions from the chat.
Okay. Well, and I don't have any other questions. So maybe Brigit got any questions for us, or?
Yeah, if I have any questions for you, I guess out of the experiences that you saw today, were any surprising or any like made you the most excited of, oh, I want to try that out right now?
Yeah, well, I didn't know about vscode.dev yet. And to see, you could get pretty far with just that before you actually need compute on the back end. So I think that's a really cool thing if you just quickly want to go into a repository and you have your markdown editor, for example, so editing a README becomes really easy. I think that's a really nice thing to know about. I think that would be the first one.
Awesome.
For me, the same, because I knew about Visual Studio Code.dev, but I thought it was just like a very simple text editor with some markup languages being supported. But it's way more than just an editor.
Yeah, that's great. And then, yeah, I'm glad that I was able to chat with you all about it so other folks could see that too.
Yep.
All right. So Brigit, thanks so much for your session. I learned a lot. Hopefully the other people watching also learned a lot. And I guess it's about time to wrap up for this evening. So I want to do one shout out. The 13th of April, Azure Live is on, and you have the chance to win a goodie bag if you register at azurelive.com. Am I saying this correctly? I think I am. There we are. That's the URL. And if you register there, you can win a really cool bag of swag from Azure Live. So that's nice.
Yep.
And with that, I would like to say thanks so much and see you next month.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.